So it will be posted to our website and by the end of the week, I hope so. If you know somebody that wanted to hear it but couldn't make it, you can let them know to check on our website. And I wanted to give special thanks tonight to the Emmanuel Synagogue, where Debbie Melman started this off by asking me if we could do a program together, and that got me looking to see what we might be able to do. And when I saw that that Pamela had a website for her book, I thought maybe I'll just reach out and see if she's available. So wonderful that we could arrange to have this on Zoom. Especially like to thank Emmanuel Synagogue, Congregation Beth Israel, and the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County for financial support in helping us to sponsor this program tonight, and the UConn Judaic Studies program for also being a co-sponsor. So we're delighted to have had so much interest in this program, and I'm so glad that you could join us this evening. Because it's a relatively large group, we're asking people to stay muted while Professor Nadell is speaking. And if there's a question you'd like me to ask her later on, please put it in the chat, or you could unmute when we get to a Q&A period of time. Yeah, we should be fine. If we have any problem with connection, I might ask people to turn off their video, but for now, it's fine. It's nice to be able to see your faces. So, so as you know, Professor Nadell's book, America's Jewish Women, was the winner of a National Jewish Book Award last year, and also the Everett Family Foundation Jewish Book of the Year, which is quite a nice set of accolades. And she's also known for her book, Women Who Would Be Rabbis, A History of Women's Ordination, which is, if you aren't familiar with, you can check that out as well. And we discussed in setting this up that since tomorrow actually is the official anniversary of the full ratification of the 19th Amendment for women's suffrage, that Professor Nadell's talk tonight will highlight activist Jewish women, including some of those who fought for suffrage 100 years ago. So without further ado, please take it away.
Thank you.
Stop sharing my screen and let you.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for coming. As we were chatting before, there's so much content out there on Zoom. I'm just thrilled that you want to hear a little bit about this book that I wrote, America's Jewish Women, and I'm going to share my screen, and I hope you can see it. And if you don't want to see everybody, you just use speaker view, and then you can see me and you can see the slides. So I'm going to do something a little bit unusual for a book talk, especially by an academic. I'm going to show you some family photos. Okay, so sometimes this works and sometimes it doesn't. Let's see. We'll go here. Oh, wait, I didn't. Okay, there we go. Got it. So this is my great-grandmother. And it's, you can see it's framed, it's hanging on the wall of my dining room. And if you look really carefully at her forehead, I don't know if you can see the arrow, but if you look really carefully at her forehead, it's very clear that she's wearing a sheitel, right? A sheitel is the wig that an observant married Jewish woman would have worn. And many observant married Jewish women still wear them down until today. And I know the photo was taken in the first decade of the 20th century, but I always thought she looked super old-fashioned. And once, when I was out giving a talk in person, I saw one of my former students who's getting a PhD in apparel design to work in a museum. She told me what my great-grandmother is wearing, the dress. It went out of style in the 1870s. So it really confirmed what I thought, was that she was incredibly old-fashioned. Here is a photo taken at about the same time of her daughter, my grandmother. She's about 14, and she's very she. She has a bow in her hair. You could see that you could see on your screens, it's the advantage of screens, bows on her shoes. And the dress that she's wearing was called a lingerie or a linen dress, and it was in style only between 1903 and 1910. So yes, she was very au courant. In this family photo, the woman with her back to us is in a park on a warm spring day, and it's my mother. And she's wearing a white blouse and a black pencil skirt. And if you look really carefully over here, there's a baby's bonnet peeking over her shoulder, and that's me. So I didn't bring a photo of me because you could see me, or at least part of me. And I'm wearing what I always wear, which is sort of the uniform of the female professor. I'm wearing a black jacket. But I did bring a photo of my daughter. And my daughter, this was taken probably at the end of college, and she's wearing, you know, what a college student might wear in the 21st century. She's got on a short skirt, she's got on tall boots, and she's taking a selfie. And I'm going to come back to the point about the selfie in a minute. But she said, when I said, can I have a photo of you to use? She said, yeah, Mom, you can use this, but you know, you have to tell them that the boots are yours. Of course, I completely forgot that they were mine and that she had walked off to college with them. So the point is, why am I talking about clothing? I'm talking about their clothing because as the clothing of the women in my family changed, so had their lives. If I think about my great-grandmother, she was one of 2 million East European Jewish immigrants who came to America at the turn of the century. If I think about her daughter, my grandmother raised her children in the Great Depression. My mother came of age shortly after World War II. She had some college. She worked as a secretary, very typical for a woman of her day. She got married, and then she stopped to raise her children. And then when it was time to go back to work, she started out as a secretary, but pretty quickly switched careers and became a real estate agent and worked into her 80s. I was really lucky. I rode the coattails of a revolution that I didn't make, but that led me into my career as a professor in the university. And my daughter is actually riding the same coattails of that revolution because she's in medical school. And that would not have been possible, nor would my career have been possible before that revolution took place. So what interested me about their lives was also, when I think about it, I wanted to think about how had women's lives changed over the course of the entire American Jewish experience. What was different about the way they raised their families? What about the kinds of work they did, the kinds of work they were prohibited from doing? What about their politics? What had changed? I wanted to know, what about the games that they played? I wanted to know, when did Mahjong become a Jewish woman's game? And I can tell you that it was in the 1920s. Most of all, I also wanted to know about how technology had impacted their lives. So take a look at this photo. If you think about the photo of my daughter and the selfie, you know, and the cell phone, here is a photo that shows us how dramatic technology advanced women's lives. I don't know, if you were in person, I would ask you to tell me what she's doing, but I can't, so I'll tell you, she's doing laundry. She's in a tenement in New York City in the second decade of the 20th century, and she's doing laundry. And I do like to think that this was a staged photo. She actually, the shoes she's wearing seem to be too good for somebody who's doing laundry. I also like to think that maybe she would not have been holding the baby while she was stirring the hot water on the stove top. But think about laundry for a minute in this era. She's lucky. She's got taps over here, so she can fill that huge bin, although she probably couldn't even fit it in the sink. Then she's got to heat the water. She's got to dump the clothes in and the soap in. She's stirring it with something that you can see. Then she's got to put the baby down, take everything out, wring it out, haul that wet laundry up to the roof of the tenement, hang it out to dry, hope that it doesn't rain, go up when it's dry, haul it back down, and then probably also have to iron some of it. Doing laundry was an incredibly intensive, difficult job, and electric laundry machines, washing machines, are not invented until the beginning of the 20th century. So when I talk about technology, I mean about how it affected and impacted women's lives. But most of all, what did I want to know about these women? I wanted to know what it meant to them to be Jewish women. because the women in my family and the women in my stories were all Jewish women. And Jewish is a really large and difficult category to think about. And I think about it in three different ways. There are women for whom being Jewish and practicing Judaism sat at the core of their lives and sits at the core of their lives. They move from Sabbath to Sabbath, from holiday to holiday. Judaism determined what they cooked in their kitchens, the butcher that they shopped at, the synagogue they went to, the people they socialized with, and it fixed every single one of the rites of passage of their lives. But for another group of Jewish women in American Jewish history, Jewishness mattered. Not so much Judaism. They may not have moved from Sabbath to Sabbath, but the fact that they were Jewish determined so much about their lives, where they lived, who they married, how much education they got, because we know that Jews were disproportionately well educated, both men and women, and that remained true at the beginning of the 20th century down until where we are now in the 21st century. So it really had a major effect in their lives, even if they were not moving from Sabbath to Sabbath. There's a third category of Jewish women that I talk about, for whom being Jewish was essentially inconsequential. They didn't pay much attention to it. They didn't think that it mattered. But every once in a while, as we will see, they bumped up against someone who told them that actually it mattered quite a lot. So I like to think of it this way. If you think you can be a little bit Jewish, you think you can be a little bit pregnant. So two women will lead me into our story. The first you may not have heard of. Every once in a while I come across somebody who has. Her name was Grace Nathan. And you can see her dates. She was born in 1752, died in 1831. And if you think about those years, if you're a history buff like I am, you know that she lived through the Revolutionary War, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the War of 1812. But what does she write about in the letters she left behind in the archives? She writes about a niece who has been spitting up blood for several weeks. But the doctors are not terribly worried because they think her corsets are too tight. Clothing matters. And this woman will also take us into our story. Emma Lazarus, I assume most of you have heard of her. She's the poet who wrote The New Colossus, the poem in the base of the Statue of Liberty. It's been welcoming the huddled masses yearning to breathe free to America for more than a century. I quipped at one point, she was in the news so much while the immigration crisis has been going on that I think people think she's still alive. She is not, but what you probably don't know is that she was Grace Nathan's great-granddaughter. So here are two women who were constrained by the times they lived in, by the fact that they were women, by the fact that they were middle class, by the fact that they were Jews and they were Americans. And yet they used the freedoms of America to push back against what women were supposed to be doing and how they were going to have an impact on the Jewish community. So let me explain what I mean by that. Emma Lazarus wrote a poem called In Exile, in which she imagined her ancestors who had been expelled from Spain, trudging out of Spain and coming to this new land that had given her people the freedom to follow Moses's law. And then she says, and to think the thoughts Spinoza taught. If you know who Benedict de Spinoza was, you know that he was a 17th century Dutch Jewish philosopher who was expelled from his Amsterdam Jewish community because of his heretical ideas. In claiming him, she is changing Judaism at her moment in time. Now, maybe that's not so unusual for someone who was a poet and who was an internationally known, celebrated figure. But what is really striking is her great-grandmother in her very traditional clothing for an 18th century or 19th century woman. Her great-grandmother did something similar. Maybe you've heard of an ethical will. It's the will that someone writes towards the end of their life where they leave their life's lessons to their family members. And Grace Nathan wrote one. And in it, she said, at my death, she's writing to her only son, keep your beard only for 7 days. If you know Jewish tradition, you know that a son does not shave following the death of a parent for a minimum of 30 days, if not for an entire year. She, this traditional Jewish woman, was changing Jewish custom. And that the fact that they were both mavericks in terms of Judaism is going to take us into this story. We're going to see even when Jewish women didn't know who went before them, we're going to see them repeating this kind of idea of using America's freedoms to act for their people and for their tradition. So I'm going to jump back now to the 17th century, to Abigail Levy Franks, 17th, 18th century. And Abigail Levy Franks, who we see in this beautiful portrait here, came to America, so the colonies, to New York, when she was 7 years old. When she was 16, she married Jacob. He was 24. Today, in most states, a marriage between a 16-year-old and a 24-year-old would be illegal. But it wasn't illegal back then. Not only that, it was actually expected because Jacob had to earn enough money to be able to support not only a wife, but the family that would quickly follow. And Abigail had 9 children. 2 of them died when they were young, so 7 rose to maturity. That number, by the way, is not the record for a colonial Jewish woman. The record belongs to Rebecca Machado Phillips of Philadelphia. She had 21 children. And as somebody said, she almost ran out of names of the Bible to give them. So the reason we know about Abigail and this 18th century Jewish world is because she wrote a treasure trove of letters to her eldest son, Naphtali, when he sailed to England to join the family business with his father's brother, his uncle. And Abigail was a traditional Jewish woman. She went to the synagogue, although she complained about the women who were in the ladies' balcony. She didn't really like them. She told Naphtali, she wrote her son a letter and said this in the letter. She said, never eat anything at your uncle's house except for bread and butter. Now, of course, he didn't listen to that. He actually married his cousin, his uncle's daughter. But it's a message saying she doesn't trust the kashrut of her sister-in-law's kitchen. And then she was even more of a maverick because she complained about Judaism's idol ceremonies and senseless superstitions. And she wrote, and I quote, if a Calvin or a Luther would rise amongst us, I would be the first of their followers. Can you imagine this? This is a woman claiming that she wants a reformer like Martin Luther or John Calvin to come to Judaism and reform Judaism. And this happens almost a century before Reform Judaism begins to take off in first Europe and then in the United States. It's a stunning statement. But she learned the price of those radical impulses because she discovered to her dismay that her daughter Phila had been married for 6 months secretly to the Protestant Oliver Delancey, had stayed in her mother's home, and I have to assume that the way she hid the marriage was she wasn't pregnant. And I've always assumed that she discovered that she was pregnant, but I have no evidence for that. And when that happened, Abigail's spirit was so crushed that she wrote that she never wanted to see or speak to anyone again. We don't think she did that. She did continue to write to Naphtali, but we don't know if she ever reconciled with Phila, because we have a letter from Jacob writing to Naphtali where he says, I'm trying to get your mother to talk to your sister. So people think the question of intermarriage, which has become such a major question in the modern Jewish community in the latter decades of the 20th century, they don't remember that it starts at the beginning of American Jewish history in colonial days. So I'm going to skip ahead because we only have limited time. I'm going to leave behind the colonial world of Abigail Levy Franks. I'm going to leave behind the early republic of Grace Nathan and the years of the 19th century when Emma Lazarus was alive and introduce this woman, Rosa Sonnenschein. Rosa Sonnenschein came to America in the 1860s with her husband, Rabbi Solomon Sonnenschein. And they settled in St. Louis, where he became rabbi of a leading Reform synagogue, because now the impulses that Abigail Levy Franks had yearned for had materialized, and we have Reform Judaism in the United States. In St. Louis, she does what a rabbi's wife should do. First of all, she gives birth to the last of her 4 children, no more 9 children, but 4 children. She is active in the synagogue, as a rabbi's wife should be, and she does something also incredibly unusual. In 1879, she founded the first Jewish women's book club in America. And believe it or not, if you think your book club has been meeting for a long time, the one she founded is still meeting today. It's called the Pioneers. And they even kept a list of the subjects that they studied every year, because each year they would read a book on one particular subject. So she did one more thing that was a little unusual, actually very unusual for 1892. She walked out on her husband. The marriage had been bad for a really long time. And by leaving him in an era when you needed grounds to get divorced, she gave him grounds to divorce her. By the way, you needed grounds to get divorced in New York State until 1964. So it's not just back in the 19th century. So now she's got to earn a living. So what's she going to do? She creates the first English language Jewish women's magazine in America, and she called it the American Jewess. The word Jewess today is often somewhat ironic. It's not used that much, although I see different places where it crops up. But basically, the word Jewess was not sardonic. It was not ironic. It was what Jewish women called themselves. Jewish men called Jewish women. Gentile men and women called Jewish women Jewesses. And it's in use until about 1940. And then it begins to kind of decrease in usage. But the fact that she called her magazine the American Jewess shows you that it was the right term for Jewish women at that time. So what is she writing about? Who is she spotlighting? How is she showing change? And she does that by writing about the first of the powerhouse Jewish women's organizations, the National Council of Jewish Women. It was founded in 1893. And it was an organization that took on social service at a time of tremendous immigration to America, East European Jewish immigration to America, but it also combated anti-Semitism. And it did that by fighting against the international rings of white slavers, international rings of traffickers and prostitution. And although other historians have often said to me, oh, you know, the Jewish women's organizations, they're just social. Well, they may have been just social, except that being social took them all the way to the White House in 1926. So I see these Jewish women's organizations, these legacy Jewish women's organizations, as powerhouses with particular agendas. Here's another example, Hadassah. Founded in 1912, in 1913, it sent 2 nurses to Palestine. They hung out this sign, Hadassah Nurses Settlement. In the first year, they saw 5,000 patients. But nursing, which was not typically a Jewish woman's profession, also resonated in these years when in 1918, well, I'm going to come back to that, when in 1918, the Spanish flu hit New York. This woman, Lillian Wald, had also been a social service worker. She founded the Henry Street Settlement House. And she was actually made chairman of the Nurses Emergency Council established in New York to marshal men and women to help resolve the crisis. And you see this pamphlet here that she had printed and handed out when she became chairman, a stern task for stern women to fight the Spanish influenza. What is different about the 1918 Spanish influenza in New York and different from our moment in time today, that Nurses Emergency Council was only meeting for 1 month from October to November 1918. After that, the flu moved on and moved further into New York. But Jewish women didn't always need an organization to be an activist. In 1902, when the price of kosher meat on the Lower East Side of New York rose from 12 cents a pound to 18 cents a pound. I know that seems like insane, but 12 cents a pound to 18 cents a pound. Jewish women, poor immigrant Jewish women who couldn't afford to feed their families, massed outside butcher shops. You can see here, you can see some of the sign, Basar Kasher, kosher butcher, massed outside the butcher shops, broke into them, smashed their windows, took the meat out, threw it out in the streets, and doused it with kerosene and sometimes set it aflame. They launched the first of the kosher meat boycotts. It was by no means the last. There will be meat boycotts and rent strikes that Jewish women would be in the forefront of well down into the 20th century. And given where we are today, I thought I would share this photo with you because it's another way where Jewish women were activists. This woman, suffragette Sophia Lobinger, in New York in 1910. I want you to look at this photo. It just literally fell in my lap a couple of weeks ago, and I wrote an article about her in the forward that I published last week on the anniversary when Tennessee did the ratification. But the official ratification day of the 19th Amendment is tomorrow, when the U.S. Secretary of State signed the document and added it to the Constitution. And think about what it meant. Now, she's a well-to-do woman, middle class, maybe even middle upper class woman, but think about what it meant to climb a ladder and stand in a sea of male faces and ask them to give women the vote. And she did this in 1910. That was 10 years before the suffrage amendment gets ratified. So Jewish women are activists in their organizations, they're activists in their homes and in the streets, and they're activists for all sorts of different causes. But I was also interested, and I'm going to come back here. I'm going to come back to that in a second. I was also interested in how Jewish women changed the home. I didn't want to think only about Jewish women as activists. And I don't know if you've ever read Kate Simon's Bronx Primitive. She was a travel writer and a wonderful memoirist. It's a slim volume, maybe 120 pages. I completely recommend it. She tells a story in here about what's going on in her home. And the story that she tells is that every Friday, her mother would polish the furniture with lemon oil and make gefilte fish. And then as Sabbath Eve would descend, she would cover her hair like a good Jewish woman should. She wasn't wearing a wig like my great-grandmother. And she would light the candles and she would begin to bless them and say the prayer. One Sabbath Eve, in the middle of the prayer, she stopped, tore off her headcloth, blew out the candles, and turned to her astonished family and said, "No more. I never believed in it, and I don't have to do it to please my mother because she's not here." And according to Kate Simon, her mother never lit Sabbath candles again. But the house still smelled of lemon oil and gefilte fish on Friday eves. And I love that story because it tells us how Jewish women, going back to Grace Nathan, were continuing to change what it meant to be a Jew in America. There's one more example of the way that Jewish women were activists and stood up, and that was when they faced anti-Semitism, a topic that is hot in the news today. I'm actually teaching a freshman seminar on the long history of anti-Semitism, and I want to share with you two stories about that. Edna Ferber was a Pulitzer Prize winning playwright. She wrote Showboat, she wrote Giant. In the 1930s, shortly after Hitler came to power, she was invited to a soiree at a Michigan industrialist, and it was a home that was out of the city, and all the guests would be staying overnight. At dinner, the industrialist started talking about money-grubbing Jews controlling the world. And she watched as everybody around the dinner table started to agree. And she turned to the assembled guests and she said, "I am a Jew." And she said she had never seen such hatred on the faces of people that she was having dinner with. That night, when she went to her room, not only did she lock her door, she put a chair against it. And she is by no means the last Jewish woman to face anti-Semitism. Many of you will remember Bess Meyerson, who was the first and only Jewish woman ever named Miss America, crowned Miss America. But what you may not know about Bess Meyerson, who became Miss America in 1945 as the war was ending, was that most of the sponsors of the Miss America commercials, the programs, they would have sent her around the country as Miss America advertising their products, most of them pulled out because she was a Jew. Instead, she spent her year wearing her crown, mostly speaking for the Anti-Defamation League. So Bess Meyerson makes the news in 1945, and a number of women begin making the news in the 1950s and early 1960s. And I'm going to share just a couple of snippets with you. Maybe you remember Dr. Joyce Brothers, television psychologist, personality. But what you may not remember is that the way that she honed her radio and TV chops was that it was the 1950s. She was very unusual. She'd gotten a PhD in psychology. She wants to stay home and raise her only child, but her husband is a medical doctor on his residency, and they can't afford to live on his salary. Residents don't make a lot of money. So either her husband says to her, or she says to him, you know, you're really smart. Why don't you memorize a boxing encyclopedia and go on one of those newfangled TV shows? So she does. She goes on the $64,000 question. She wins not $64,000, but $128,000, and then launches a career as a television psychologist. And so her name is in the news in the 1950s. So is this woman, Ruth Handler. She invented Barbie. You won't be surprised to learn that she had 2 children, and they were named Barbara and Ken. So was this couple in the news by the early 60s. This is Carole King. She was born Carol Klein and Jerry Goffin. It's on their wedding day. They wrote a song that was on the charts. It was called Will You Love Me Tomorrow? And the reason they're getting married is she's pregnant. What can a woman do who's pregnant in the 1950s, 1960s? She's got 3 choices. She can go away and give up the baby, and I have cases of Jewish women who did that and mourned for that loss their entire lives. She could try and have an abortion, which was not only dangerous for her, but for the abortionist, because the physicians who were giving abortions and abortionists were getting arrested in these years. Or she could marry the father or somebody else who was willing to marry her. So here they get married. And of course, Betty Friedan, the feminine mystique. 1963. So the reason is, why do I group these 5 women together? I group them together because we have an image of the 1950s. This is our image of the 1950s, comes from the National Museum of American Jewish History. It's the mothers of the baby boom pushing the baby boomers into the future. The baby boomers they pushed into the future would make a revolution whose coattails I rode. And honestly, a lot of those mothers would also join that revolution because women pushing baby carriages have an awful lot of time to think. So the 50s and the 60s, this early post-war period, is really complicated in America's American Jewish women's lives. And I want to add 3 more figures to complicate it. Luba Bott. Luba Bott survived World War II and came to America because a chance meeting with her uncle, Sidney Hillman, who was an important labor leader and worked with FDR during the wartime administration. She had met him in Paris, and he brought her to the United States. She was a nurse, so nursing seems to be a theme tonight. And she couldn't be a nurse in America because her transcript hadn't survived, or her diploma. So this is really astonishing. Somehow it did survive, and it was brought over to America, even amid all the destruction in Poland, where she was from. And she learned English, passed a nursing licensing exam in New York, and then practiced as a nurse in the US. But what really interests me about her story is that 2 weeks after she got here, one of her aunts turned to her and said, "Tell me everything that happened now and then never speak of it again." So Lubabat told her she had survived the destruction of the ghetto in Lodz. She had been captured by the Nazis. They beat her. They wanted her to confess that she was a Jew. She wouldn't confess, so they sent her to Auschwitz anyway, but as a Polish political prisoner. She had survived Auschwitz, and she told her of the horrors. And then, I don't know if she ever spoke of it again, but she did leave 2 volumes of an unpublished memoir for me to find in the Yad Vashem archives in Jerusalem. So she's an example of the tens of thousands of America's Jewish men and women who were Holocaust survivors who came to America, and the legacy of their experience hung over not only their lives, but the lives of their children and their grandchildren down until today. These are also the years of the communist witch hunt, and the executions of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg sent a Cold War chill across America's Jews who had embraced the politics of the left, men and women, and really shut down the Jewish left for a very long time. And these are also the years, well before Stonewall, when LGBT rabble-rouser Jerry Fayer leaves her husband and kids and goes to hang out in the lesbian subterranean clubs of Greenwich Village. So the 50s are more complicated than we think of. And this, back to technology, ushers in the 60s. So remember frozen TV dinners? They're invented in the late 1950s. And when I think of the 60s, I think of these images, right? I mean, think about the 60s. The Vietnam War, the Beatles, the Kennedy assassination, Martin Luther King, Woodstock, Mao Zedong, Stonewall Uprising, the moon landing. But when I think of the 60s in terms of America's Jewish women's history, this is what I think of: women on the march. And what is astonishing is the number of Jewish women who are in the forefront, in the leadership of this movement. And we don't really have adequate explanations for why. I mean, I have some ideas. We could talk about them later. But because of time, I'm only going to tell you about 2 who you might not be as familiar with. I expect you're familiar with Betty Friedan. But there was a Holocaust refugee, rather a German Jewish refugee. She came in the 1930s, so not a Holocaust refugee. Her name was Sonia Pressman. She came to the United States. She got a law degree. She wants to work as a lawyer. Every time she goes out on a job interview, what do they say to her? They say, "You can be my secretary." So she ends up working for the US government in the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission. That was a commission established in 1964 to enforce the Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act that prohibited discrimination on the basis of race and sex in employment. So she's working at the EEOC, and the complaints are coming in, and 2/3 are about racial discrimination, and 1/3 are about sex discrimination. But the men who are her bosses, who decide which cases to take, are ignoring all the sex discrimination cases. So she turns to Betty Friedan and she says, "We need a civil rights organization for women in America." And they founded the National Organization for Women. 12% of its founding members were Jewish women at a time when Jews make up about 3% of the population of the United States. Another Jewish woman, also a refugee, this one from Vienna, came to America. Her name was Gerda Lerner. And she, in the United States, does something really unusual. In the 1960s, when she's already in her early 40s, she gets a PhD in history at Columbia University and writes a dissertation about 2 Southern Christian women who were abolitionists. And she launches the writing of American women's history in the academy. In 1972, this woman who had adopted America as her country begins petitioning the government to establish a Women's History Week. Today, March is Women's History Month. So it's just an example of two women who made such changes and impacted America, not just America's Jewish women. So I don't know if the synagogue who's sponsoring this tonight, Emmanuel, I don't know if you've got photos like this on the wall, but maybe some of you have seen these photos on the walls of synagogues. It's the rabbi surrounded by, most of the time, the young women who are in the confirmation class. Pretty rare that there were boys, but sometimes there were boys in the confirmation class. And all the young women are wearing the robes. And I think of this as, this is what Judaism used to look like, right? This is what the Jewish world looked like. This photo is actually particularly important because this woman to the rabbi's left is Ruth Bader, later Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I like to say that this is Ruth Bader Ginsburg at her confirmation and not at her confirmation hearings. And this is what the Jewish world has come to look like, at parts of it, not everywhere, as a result of the impact of feminism on American Judaism. So I'm going to stop sharing so I can see all of you, which will be great. And I'm going to tell you, I'm going to kind of sum up a little bit and tell you one more story, and then we'll take questions, okay? So just think of how much we did, and I don't know, maybe we've been on for like 40 minutes. I'm going to check what that time is and see. So yeah, in about 45 minutes, think of how far we've gone. We went from the colonial times up until almost all the way till today, 2019. We talked about Jewish women who were religiously Jewish, for whom Jewishness was important, for whom Jewishness wasn't so important, but somebody else told them it was. And we saw dramatic changes in their lives, and we saw how their activism from the colonial days down until today impacted both America and the American Jewish community, and the world Jewish community as well. So here's my closing story. Do you remember that when there was a movement to free Soviet Jewry, boys and girls for their bar and bat mitzvahs would be twinned with a child in the Soviet Union during their bar bat mitzvah ceremony? Remember that? Yeah, I'm seeing a couple of nods. So in 1982, in North Miami Beach, the American twin writes to her Soviet twin, who supposedly cannot have a bat mitzvah. Well, actually, I know she did. And she says to her, she says, "Did you get the letters that I sent you and the stationery that I sent you?" And her twin, I found this letter from the North Miami Beach, the American, but I didn't have any response from the twin. So I did what a very good historian today does. I went on Facebook. I found the twin living in Jerusalem. She had gotten out of the Soviet Union. Today she's a web designer. And I said to her, "Did you ever get this letter from North Miami Beach from your American twin?" And she said, "You know, I don't know, that actually there were like one kid in the Soviet Union was actually twinned with a lot of people in the United States." So I said, "Okay, well, by any chance, are you and your twin from North Miami Beach, are you Facebook friends?" And she said no, that she and her American twin, this American twin, whose name is Sheryl Sandberg, COO of Facebook, they are not Facebook friends, but her father and Sandberg's mother are. So I love ending here because it's a story about another pair of letter writers. I followed letter writers all the way through this book, and they will take us into the 21st century. So thanks for joining, and I think we've got a few minutes left for questions, right? We tried to leave time for questions.
Absolutely. Yeah, so if people have questions, if you just like raise your hand like this, I'll try to call on you and unmute, or you can also put a question into the chat if you just want people to see it right away.
I think Anne Peskin was asking. I think I saw her hand up.
Sure.
Where did Abigail and Jacob live?
New York City.
In New York City.
In New York City. Now remember, the New York City that they were living in was much smaller than the New York City. But here's a really fun detail. When Abigail's so depressed, she actually retreats to her country home, which is in Brooklyn. So Brooklyn must have been, like the wilds back then.
Thank you. Even today, when I was a young girl, in the 40s and 50s, Brooklyn was wild.
That's great. There probably, I see a comment, there are probably a lot of women you could have mentioned, but what about Gloria Steinem? Gloria Steinem is her grandmother was Jewish, her father was Jewish, and she is often identified as Jewish. And she's in the book, but they're given the breadth of Jewish women's activism. There was no way that I could include everybody. I will tell you that I just recently published an article about Bella Abzug, who does appear in the book, but not in as much detail as in the article that I published, because here was this incredible Jewish woman who was also, I mean, not just a maverick. Think about Bella Abzug. She gets elected to Congress in 1970. There are 435 members of Congress. She's sworn in one of 15 women with 420 men. I mean, she was a maverick in every way, but when she was 13 in the 1930s, her father died, and every morning for a year, she went to an Orthodox synagogue and said Kaddish for him. And even though no female was saying Kaddish back then. So I just, there's so many that I didn't have time to talk about. I see a question Rochelle Gold asks, you've talked mostly about women in big cities. How about women in rural America and small towns? I definitely do talk about women in rural America and small towns. One of my favorite stories is about Fanny Brooks. Fanny Brooks was 16 years old, and Julius Brooks had been a peddler in America. Most Central European, German, Jewish immigrants started out as peddlers. He goes home to visit his parents, and she turns to him and she says, and they're cousins, and she says, I want to go to America with you. And he says, well, you can't do that unless we're married. Your parents aren't going to let you do that. So they get married. She comes to America. It's in the 1840s. And we think, is the first Jewish woman to cross the plains in a covered wagon. And she raised her children out in the western frontier. So I definitely pay attention to Jewish women also in the South and in the West.
We might have had a question from Rhonda Ginsburg. Is that right?
Okay.
Well, actually, I'm her husband, Larry, but we're together.
Go ahead, Larry.
Could you comment on the Nathan sisters in the early 20th century New York on both sides of the suffrage issue?
Absolutely. So they're a riot, aren't they? They're so much fun. So Maud Nathan is probably the best known Jewish suffragist. She was president of the Consumers League, which was an organization that tried to improve the conditions for working girls. And she was an activist. I mean, she had a tragic story. She lost a daughter very young, and she threw herself into this work. And she's everywhere as a suffragist. Her sister, Annie Nathan Mayer, was an anti-suffragist. And what's really interesting is Annie Nathan Mayer was the founder of Barnard College. So she's kind of embarrassing for Barnard College because she's an anti-suffragist. They didn't speak over the issue. The family actually, they're part of the same Nathan family as, by the way, Grace Nathan and Emma Lazarus. And people have wondered, was Annie just being, kind of stubborn? But Annie Nathan Mayer really believed that politics, and a lot of the antis, that's what we call them, the antis, they believed that politics was dirty and that women would be sullied by being engaged in politics, and that women were much better represented, their votes were better represented by men. But when when suffrage came in, Annie Nathan Mayer did join the League of Women Voters, which was the heir to the suffrage organizations. So yeah, I see. So I see.
I also had another question that was sent to me privately. Can I just
okay.
that to you? When we think of Hadassah or Jewish Women's Council, I wonder how common it was for members of those groups to call for cooperation with men. In other words, when did the need to have male allies become explored within these groups, and whether they push back from either men or women?
So the answer is always and never. What happens, so for example, something that I'm working on right now, I'm working on anti-Semitism. And I literally, before I got on today, I was reading records of the National Council of Jewish Women, and they cooperated with the Anti-Defamation League. So there are places where we see them working together. But when I wrote about the women Zionist organizations in the book, I wrote about Hadassah, I wrote about Pioneer Women, I wrote about Mizrahi women. These were, and their names changed. They became Naamat and I forgot what the other one is, but it'll come to me in a second. But what happened in those organizations was the women's organizations start after the men's organizations. And then the men try to co-opt the women's organizations. They actually try to take their money because the women are such successful fundraisers, they want to decide how to spend it. And what you see is a struggle in all of these women Zionist organizations with the male organizations. And eventually Hadassah leaves what was the Zionist Organization of America after a series of these fights and becomes its own independent Zionist organization with its own representation at the World Zionist Congress. So the answer is there was cooperation sometimes, and sometimes there wasn't.
You can see the question about women entrepreneurs in the 30s and 40s.
Right. I love that question that Rhonda says that her grandmother had her own women's clothing store in Chicago during the Depression after her husband's business failed. What's very interesting is I write about, I have it, the book is 5 chapters. It's only 250 pages. The original manuscript was twice as long. A lot of stuff ended up on the floor, but my women entrepreneurs did not end up getting cut because they are so important. I wrote about a series of women, many of them in the clothing business, but not all, in the 1920s and the 1930s who are running their own businesses. Everything from cosmetics to maiden-form bras, to a woman who actually, she would say really traditional things, but meanwhile she was running a business importing cigarette papers from France in the 1930s. So I wrote a lot about that, and this is just the history of Jewish women's entrepreneurial activities is an enormous history. There really needs to be a book on it, just on that subject. Can I take Arnie's question? Hi, Arnie. I don't see you, but I'm sure you're there somewhere. How do we account for the reasons, this is from Arnie Dashevsky, for the reasons that these women burst the bounds that confined women in general and Jewish women in particular in these early days? I think, first of all, from the academic, always the toughest question. I think what happens is that Jewish women are educated to break boundaries. And this is particularly true. I see it in the 60s, but if I would go back, it would become even clearer. Jewish women are disproportionately well educated. And as you and I both like to think, since we teach in the university, I like to think that education makes a powerful difference in somebody's lives. The Jewish women who were disproportionately going to college they know how to speak, they know how to write, they know how to think, they know how to present their ideas. Frankly, in the 60s, they also learned how to run a mimeograph machine. So they were able, through their educations, through Judaism's traditions about social justice, which are very important, and also through what many of them saw as sexism in Judaism, they were able to push against the boundaries of and the constraints that they had. So I do think there's a lot there, and we could have a separate conversation. I'd be happy to have an extended conversation about it.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Nadell. It was a wonderful talk, and I did just put into the chat the website where you can find out more about her book. And I'm sure there's a lot more to explore in there than we've been able to address today, but that was a wonderful overview, and certainly a fitting way for us to acknowledge the importance of women's activism over over a long period of time and Jewish women's exploration of their identity. So thank you so much for joining us. And if anybody wants to stay around and ask another question, perhaps that'll be possible.
Sure, I'm happy to stay on. Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us. And thanks again to the different groups that helped us bring this program to the community here in the greater Hartford area. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed.
All right, somebody started to talk, but I can't hear.
Yeah, I'm trying to unmute. Joan, you're trying to speak? Let me try to unmute you, sorry.
I appreciated all that Pamela shared with us. It was very interesting, and I hope this continues. I hope we'll have more opportunities to listen to all these good, warm-hearted voices. It'd be lovely.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
This is Marcy Schoenfeld. I saw, growing up in the 60s, a large percentage of Jewish women became teachers.
Yeah.
Was that true in other cities too? Or was that just because our mothers told us to become teachers?
So teaching was known in New York City as the Jewish profession. In the 1920s, because of the free university system that Hunter College, that women could go to Hunter College, the preponderant majority of the students at Hunter College in the 1920s and the 1930s were Jewish women. And so this is not true everywhere, although I do think it happened in other places as well. Kate Simon's mother told her, become a teacher. Bess Meyerson's mother told her, become a teacher. So you always have a profession to fall back on in case something happens. And so Jewish women, because you have to remember that until the revolution, the feminist revolution, that women, more and more women were in the workforce, yes, but they were confined to about 10 occupations, and teaching was one of them. They didn't have as many options. So about the highest a woman could aspire to rise to would be to become a teacher or a nurse. I mean, many of the other occupations were, being a secretary or a clerical worker of some kind. So yeah, it's really quite common that Jewish women were teachers in the 60s, and then it changes as more of the doors open up to women.
The other thing you mentioned in the beginning about Mahjong, I always remember Amy Tang's book, The Joy Luck Club, when her mother's friend says, we play Chinese Mahjong, not Jewish Mahjong that you learned in college. I always found that interesting because I didn't know there was a difference, but anyway.
I know. Yeah, Mahjong is I mean, I wrote about Mahjong because I loved writing about this. In the 1920s, there's a Chinese craze in the United States, and Mahjong comes in, and Jewish women glom onto it. And I didn't talk about it, but I think the reason why is because it's intellectual. It's a hard game. And Jewish women were looking for these kinds of outlets, this intellectual outlet. And so Mahjong, it's not just friendship. That's part of it, but they played Mahjong, they played canasta, they played these games that challenged them, as well as doing a lot of social welfare work.
David and Alyssa have a question.
Yes, so where do you see the children of baby boomers, the children and grandchildren? What Jewish American women, where do you see their contributions? What might they be?
First, there's so many. It's astonishing. They're just, when I mean, this remains true today. Years ago, when we were publishing the Jewish Women in America Encyclopedia, which was edited by the late Paula Hyman and Deborah Dash Moore, we had so many Jewish women to include that we actually had this kind of artificial cutoff date. And that has just continued. The Jewish women are prominent in so many different areas and fields, in medicine, in politics, in teaching, in education, in science. And it's impossible to pick the names because it depends on the particular field. It's really, really quite astonishing. I mean, anybody who follows any of the Jewish press, you just see this coming out all the time. So I couldn't, you know, like in a particular field, I might be able to name a name, but it's just extraordinary, the number of prominent Jewish women making a difference in all sorts of different ways.
Where do most of the women's organizations today and the Jewish women stand on the ERA?
So that's a very interesting question. When the ERA was first introduced in 1923, you know, it was introduced into every single Congress until it passed Congress in 1972. The Jewish women's organizations, like most women's organizations, were actually opposed because the ERA, they feared, threatened protective legislation that had been passed that limited hours women could work, limited child labor. Also in the 1920s, there was the first federal legislation that was funding maternal care and natal care. And they were worried that if the ERA came in, that it would that would be the end of that. So they were opposed. By 1972, the Jewish organizations, the liberal Jewish organizations, which would include Hadassah, National Council of Jewish Women, and Jewish Women's International, those organizations, they all came on board and supported the ERA. And now, of course, the issue with the ERA is 3 more states ratified it. There is no constitutional mandate for a time limit on ratifying an amendment. The 27th Amendment, which prohibits, it's the most recent one, which prohibits a Congress from raising or lowering its salary, taking effect while they're in office, so you have to wait till the next one. That amendment was introduced into the first US Congress. It took 202 years for it to pass. So the issue now is 3 more states have ratified the amendment. The time limit was actually written into the original law. It was not part of the Constitution. The House has passed a bill suspending the time limit. The Senate, it's stalled in the Senate, and it'll probably end up in the courts, what's going to happen. But there are now enough states to ratify it. Whether it will happen, I don't, you know, I have no idea. The fight will continue. That's probably more than you wanted to know.
Well, thank you so much. Kim, that was great. And we're so appreciative of you spending time with us this afternoon. And thanks everybody for being part of this.
Good.
Great. Thank you. Thanks. Arnie, great seeing you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Long and prosper.
Interesting.
It was really a very smart lady.
Where does she teach?
I'm not sure.
I was going to ask her because I was curious.
American University.
Thank you. That's in Washington, D.C.
Right. She's in an endowed